Good afternoon, everybody, and my apologies for not appearing on the camera because I have a problem of to actually initiate it. So I'm going to focus much more on actually how to integrate energy decarbonization within a more comprehensive approach of humanitarian organizations. And how to put it in I would say, the bigger picture, mainly on the footprint measurement, target setting, and roadmap building, because it's important to, I would say, one of the conditions of success of decarbonization is to integrate it at the core of the strategy of an organization. So I'll start with something very practical. I mean, Catherine already presented the footprint of the ICRC. This is the footprint of a medical organization, ALIMA, which we've been supporting recently. And what you'll see is that the main source of emissions of a medical NGO like ALIMA is really concentrated on a few specific areas. So it's definitely supply, almost 40%. It's transport, both passengers and freight, 40%. And the rest is mainly energy, and mostly actually energy produced by fuel generators in the field, much more than the energy, the electricity bought off the grid. Now, what's important about baseline measurement is to make clear that the parameter of the baseline measurement is extremely important. There are different practices today within the aid community, but there's only, I would say, one credible practice in terms of international standards. It's actually to measure all three scopes of the organization's emissions, and it's important also to acknowledge that what we call scope 3, which is mainly coming from what organizations buy in terms of goods and services, represent usually more than 2/3, 70, sometimes up to 80% of the footprint of an organization. Now, what are the big challenges around baseline measurement? Well, as I said before, it's defining the parameter to include, all activities that contribute to the mandate of the organization, and this means including, emissions from partnerships and from funding other NGOs, etc. And within these, you may have some energy expenses also. It's the challenge of data collection, where you should not compromise on collecting data that will enable you to measure your footprint. And notably, I mean, energy is a very good example of where not to compromise, because usually it's relatively accessible to have to estimate the quantities of fuel used, or to see the electricity bills, etc. Whereas there are other areas where maybe more compromise is needed, and more reliance on a continuous improvement approach, and that's very much the case for procurement or how you integrate partnerships. Emission factors, they allow to calculate the emissions of an organization based on usually quantitative or financial data, and there is a regular issue of reliability of some of these factors and how they can be adapted to humanitarian contexts. There are also questions on their level of precision, especially when it comes to suppliers, for example. So why is this being put on the table when it comes to decarbonization and energy decarbonization, is that it's important to, I think, for aid organizations to really favor approaches that have, both a lot of integrity, but also which allow comparisons between organizations. If methods, are different in terms of perimeter, in terms of type of data collected, etc., there will be problems in terms of comparability. And it is also important that, progressively we're able to develop a kind of standard or reference methodology to help organizations, produce comparable data over time. Now, when it comes to targets, target is very important because, as you know, we're at a critical crossroads today in terms of global warming, with an acceleration that's going to happen in the next years and decades, and it's a fundamental strategic choice for organizations on what target to adopt in regards to this emergency situation of its own. And the consensus, as you know, is, if we want to stand a chance of stabilizing climate within the next 25 to 30 years by mid-century, the scientific consensus is that you have to halve emissions every decade from now on, which means minus 50 by 2030. And I would say building a roadmap for an aid organization is very much about how to model and plan a trajectory of solutions that's going to be adapted to its mandate, and that's going to allow to actually reinforce its mandate while cutting radically into the emissions over the next 10 years. So it's about choosing a target, an overall target, because this is going to very much determine the intensity of the efforts. So very clearly, minus 50 by 2030 is today considered the most legitimate, and this is without counting carbon offsets. It's about identifying the main solutions and actions for each lever, and the two previous panelists presented a number of them in the energy sector. Whether it's the switch to renewables for energy production, efficiency is absolutely key. Whether it's for buildings or equipment. I mean, personally, I come from a medical humanitarian background, and when it comes to, for example, cooling down pharmacies or stocks, etc. I mean, when you know that simply deploying cool roof techniques allow to sometimes reduce temperature within a pharmacy of almost 15 degrees, from 40 to 25, for example, it just shows what margin of improvement we have, and sometimes at little cost. And finally, it's energy consumption reduction actions, which also pave the way to and make it easier to switch to renewables. So a big part of the building of a roadmap is about prioritizing, evaluating these actions and prioritizing their impact versus their feasibility versus the effort of the organization that has to be done. And for each area, including, of course, energy, it means basically assessing what the feasibility of these solutions, and asking oneself, what's actually needed to carry them out over time. How do they impact operations? What are the competencies that are needed? What potential technical partnerships are required to put them in place, etc., etc. And I think it's usually when people talk about footprint reduction and decarbonization, there's a lot of insistence on technological solutions, and actually when you look at the impact of different actions in a I would say comprehensive roadmap, what you realize is that you have three different types of actions. So you definitely have technological solutions, and a lot of the energy solutions are clearly linked to techniques, many of which are ready to deploy. There are also some, I would say, behavioral actions to consider, and this is about mobilization of individuals and their responsibility. It's what people put forth a lot with good office practices, etc. But the bulk of the decarbonization effort is really around policies and processes, and how you integrate environmental considerations in decision making, and that's definitely the case for transport and travel and for procurement, and so it's important to understand that there is, I mean, one of the conditions of success for a decarbonization roadmap is to put a full emphasis on this core part, which is about internal policies and processes. Now, what are the key steps, the next key steps that are that are needed? Well, it's about modelization, and based on a solutions mix that has been identified. It's about quantification of the expected results, and going for milestones that the organization can reach over the, for example, the next period of 10 years. It's meeting the human challenge much more than the financial challenge. I mean, our work until now tends to show that a lot of the savings cover a big part of the investments needed. So it's a lot about reallocation of means, but raising the competence within the organization to actually deploy a lot of these solutions is critical. And then it's about implementation, monitoring, learning, and adjustment. And I'd like to give the example, to be more practical, of what does a trajectory of decarbonization look like. And here you have the work that's been produced by the National Health Service of the UK, which is the first big public health administration to produce a decarbonization roadmap. And what you see on this graph is their level of emissions as it has evolved, and which would in normal times be expected to actually increase over the next years because of more activities, because of more investments. And that would be, of course, very much the case for most aid organizations. The natural pathway of an aid organization in the coming years is for many actually to grow and to see, therefore, a growth of emissions. Now, what's interesting here in this modelization is that they've actually pictured how each solution identified reduces the footprint to reach the target that has actually been which is the aim, and which is at the end of the day towards what they consider to be net zero, but probably for the horizon of aid organizations, which would likely be a shorter term goal like -50 by 2030. And what's interesting here is how, through by considering external factors like the transformation of national grids, but also mainly internal levers, many of which are energy related, but not only. Well, they progressively reach their aim. Now, I'll finish there. I mean, when it comes to the Climate Action Accelerator, you know, it's a newly born initiative which was launched at the beginning of this year, which is developing partnerships with a number of aid organizations, including the ICRC, several medical NGOs such as Alima, Médecins Sans Frontières, and many others. And our approach is really, how to help organizations, halve their emissions by assembling the resources and empowering them to design these more comprehensive roadmaps. It's about helping them to become vectors of change and transform their peers also in their ecosystem. And it's about sharing climate solutions as a common good within a greater community of practice and open source. And I think I'll stop here and give you the floor back. Thank you.